Hey everyone, it's patch 3.22 Ancestor, and today I want to bring you the endgame version of Impending Doom. Today we're going to be talking about the absolute most min-maxed build that you can put together with this skill, and we are going to go through everything and show you what you can change to make this an absolute monster. Now, before we do go any further, I do want to add a disclaimer in here. This is going to be extremely aspirational, and I can guarantee you most people will not be able to afford any of this. This path of building is going to be anywhere between 2 to 3 to maybe up to 5 to 7 mirrors. And realistically, most people are not going to make that much money. But what I'm going to try to do today is to show you what you can possibly do to min-max every single stat and what you could possibly do to upgrade yourself from the mid-game path of building over to the end-game path of building. So with that out of the way, let's get it started. Now, I do want to add a disclaimer in here. This path of building will only show you 16 million DPS. Do not fret. That is not normal DPS. That is Uber DPS. I want to make that very, very clear. If you set this to Guardian Pinnacle, which most path of buildings are usually set to, we are dot capped, so we can't actually see what our DPS is. Because of that, we need to now start looking at Uber Pinnacle DPS, which is 70% lower. If the dot cap didn't exist, our true DPS on non-Uber Pinnacle would realistically be somewhere around 80 million poison DPS, which is going to be ridiculously high. But because that's not possible, we have to look at Uber Pinnacle DPS. So don't fret when it says 20 million. 20 million Uber Pinnacle DPS is a lot of damage. It is a very, very silly amount of damage. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be something that's going to be very important. I want to put it right at the start of the video. That is going to be Awakened Spell Cascade. This is going to be one of the upgrades you're going to choose to make at some point. And the important thing about Awakened Spell Cascade is it's going to give you 5 total circles instead of 3 with a normal Spell Cascade. What this means is you'll be able to hit 5 times, but you need 2 of them. Do not get 1 Awakened Spell Cascade. You need 1 for your Chestplate and you need 1 for your Vixens. Otherwise, it actually doesn't do anything. It is just a paperweight. Once you do have 2, we need to start talking about how that affects our cooldown and how that affects our breakpoints, because it's going to drastically change. Typically, with a normal setup with the Spell Cascade, you've only been assuming that you're going to be doing 3 overlaps. But with Awakened Spell Cascade, you can immediately assume you're going to do 4 overlaps. And if you manage to hit 60% cooldown recovery, you can do 5 overlaps. Do not set your path of building to 5 until you actually hit 60% cooldown recovery. And we can very easily see that by just going to the calc section path of building, going to temp chains as your socket group, swapping over to Doom Blast as our active skill, and simply hovering over the effective trigger rate to see that our cooldown recovery rate is 1.6 or 60%. If you are not at 60%, you cannot get this overlap. With that said, getting this is going to be very difficult, especially if you're running a Mageblood, because Mageblood doesn't have any cooldown on it, while the crafted build you're using before had up to 18%. But the 60% cooldown recovery breakpoint is just barely doable. It's just extremely, extremely expensive to do so with a Mageblood, so please do not go for it until you're ready. Obviously, you should be still stacking as much cooldown recovery as you can, even with the Mageblood, because every 1% is still 1% more damage because of us being able to stack more cast speed. But do not attempt to go for 60% until you are absolutely ready for it, as it's going to be very expensive. For us to be able to get there, we are going to need to get an elevated pair of Shaper cooldown recovery boots, and these are going to have to be perfectly rolled. These, when elevated, give us up to 20% cooldown recovery rate, which is substantially higher than any of the boots that we've been previously using, and are going to be a key portion of all this. Up next, we are also going to need to get ourselves a Temporal Rift. Now, I have a whole video talking about Temporal Rift, and it'll be linked in the description below if you want to know more about this, but we will need a Temporal Rift that has 20% quality. And this is the expensive part, we will need a level 5 Awaken Enhance. We absolutely need the quality breakpoint of level 5. So without this, you will not be able to hit 60%. Other than that, our other sources of cooldown recovery are going to be a perfectly rolled Balance of Terror. It's going to have to be 25% cooldown reduction. And then lastly, we're going to be fitting in 1 Abyss Jewel with cooldown recovery rate on it. Now, with all that said, all these actually add up to 61%, assuming you have perfect rolls on everything. So you can have 1% lower roll on something, but everything else has to be perfectly rolled. Keep this in mind. It's a very, very difficult breakpoint to reach, but if you can reach it, then you'll be gaining somewhere around 20% extra DPS. Now, if you don't have a Mageblood, that's not really a problem because you'll have a cooldown recovery built and it'll have up to 18% cooldown recovery on it. So if you do get a max roll of absolutely everything, you'll be at 76% cooldown recovery, which is more than enough to get your 5th overlap. Just do keep in mind that as soon as you do want to swap over to Mageblood, you are going to have to set your overlaps back down to 4 until you actually get everything. All of this is mentioned in the notes section, so please do read it if you need a refresher on all this. Other than that, let's move on to all of the gear changes. Now, I have left some notes throughout the note section of this path of building, and I please encourage you to read them, as some of these items actually just don't change at all or have just barely changed. All the notes will be in pink text. But there are going to be some items that are going to drastically change, and I want to go over them in this video as well. Now, the next major change I want to talk about is going to be your skill tree and all the things that we're going to be changing on it. Now, in terms of the actual layout of the tree, nothing has really changed. The clusters will be the same clusters. The only things that are going to be changing are the 3.22 editions of tattoos. We are going to heavily be abusing tattoos in this build to be able to get quite a lot of stats for effectively free. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about are going to be the flask effect duration tattoos. Now, these are going to be dependent on your build. You're either going to need 4 of these, 5 of these, 6 of these. It's all going to matter based on what role on a Progenesis that you get. Progenesis is a flask that you're going to want to immediately upgrade to as soon as you can, as this makes you unbelievably tanky. What it does, it takes 25% of all damage that your life takes, and instead it makes you take it over 4 seconds. When combined with a blood notch and when combined with our insane recovery, this effectively doubles our health pool and makes us pretty much not susceptible to any realistic one-shot outside of something really stupid like a crit on an ability that should have one-shot you anyway. The only important thing about Progenesis is going to be that you need to have 100% uptime on it, and doing that is a little bit difficult. I can't tell you exactly what roles to get on Progenesis because Progenesis prices massively depend on their roles. But what I recommend for you to do is to copy paste a bunch of Progenesis into Path of Building and then see how close the uptime is to 100%. You can see at the bottom, effective flask stats, the flask uptime will say 100%. Now, what you don't want is something like this. If I remove one of these tattoos, you don't want your Progenesis to say 100% average, 90% minimum. That means if you don't get lucky on your charges not being used, which we have a little bit on our tree, you can potentially have a period of time where your Progenesis isn't active. And when your Progenesis isn't active, you are substantially squishier. Now, this is completely fine, and you don't need to fix this immediately. It's just, this is something you want to be aware of, as you will want to eventually have perfect 100% uptime on it. The easiest way for us to do that is to 1, get a good roll on it, 2, put a 20% quality on the Progenesis through Hillock, and then 3, add in flask effect duration tattoos until we reach 100%. In my case, with the specific Progenesis that I had, I need to use 4 of these tattoos to have perfect 100% uptime on it. It's going to vary on your build, and you might potentially have to run 5 or 6 or 7 of these, but there's plenty of space to put them in here, as we do have a few dex nodes here and a few dex nodes here that are just 2% max life, which you could add additional flask effect duration nodes onto if you needed more. The other tattoos that we want to talk about are going to be the spell suppression tattoos. These are going to be really, really powerful as they make us able to just completely drop 1 spell suppression roll off our gear. That's going to be very important because we're not going to be able to get spell suppression on the boots that we want to upgrade to, as getting spell suppression on these is going to cost into the hundreds of divs. It's not something very realistic, but luckily for us, we could just fit in a bunch of spell suppression tattoos to reach 100%. Ideally, you want to get a max spell suppression roll on your helmet, as it's going to make it so you need 1 less spell suppression tattoo in total to be able to reach 100%. As for any other dexterity nodes that you have left over, you aren't going to really have much dexterity unless you already have a Mageblood, as the dexterity from Mageblood is actually kind of carrying your ability to remove quite literally every single dexterity node from your tree. But if you do have any leftover dexterity, add in some tattoos of the oak just to get a little bit more life. There's a few other possibilities here, but in my opinion, I don't really think you need any of them. I just feel like getting more life is the best bang for your value. Up next is going to be the Int Tattoos. So for the Int Tattoos, they're going to be very simple. We're going to need 2 reservation tattoos to be able to fit in all of our auras with a level 4 Enlighten. As for any other space that you have, you just want to fit in more max life tattoos wherever you can. You aren't going to be able to tattoo every single one of your int nodes, as you are going to need 155 int, and we don't really have space for an int roll anywhere in our gear. But if you somehow do have more ints, or if your gear is a little bit different, then feel free to tattoo the rest of these int nodes into 2% max life nodes until you just run out of int. Lastly, the other thing to mention is that we're going to be using a Tattoo of the Berserker to get Onslaught on hit. This is going to allow us to drop our Onslaught Flask, and it's the only real source of Onslaught on hit that we can get. You could also potentially just go for a Onslaught on hit Circle of Nostalgia. That's going to be a little bit more expensive to go for, especially if you want a chaos damage and buff effect one. But that is also another possibility to be on the lookout for. But the cheap option is simply just going to be getting Onslaught on hit on a 30 dex node. The last addition, which I can't really show you in Path to Building because Path to Building is not updated, is going to be a new possibility that was recently added midway through the season with Journey Tattoos. The specific Journey Tattoo that we're interested in is the Tattoo of the Makauni. What this allows us to do is it allows us to completely reroll a keystone. And because of this, we can get some very silly tech that I've borrowed from my time playing EK. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up both Ghost Dance and a random keystone. We are not taking Ghost Reaver because it's Ghost Reaver. We're simply taking it because it's a keystone. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using these tattoos to reroll Ghost Reaver until we get Mind Over Matter. What this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to use our energy shield as a secondary health pool. And if we use Ghost Dance, because we have so much evasion rating, we're going to be able to instantaneously recover all of that energy shield as soon as we get hit. Now, obviously, Ghost Dance can only work up to 3 times within a short period, but realistically, you're not going to be getting hit that often, and you're never going to be put in a position where this just doesn't help you or screw you over, especially because we're going to be running Soul Thief, which is going to give us 2% of our energy shield on kill. And while mapping between Soul Thief and Ghost Dance, you'll basically always be at maximum energy shield. And then for bosses, you realistically aren't going to be getting hit so much that Ghost Dance is never going to be active. And realistically, you're going to be so tanky, even without Ghost Dance, that you are going to be completely fine. None of this is going to screw you over. This is especially potent with a Mageblood because the Mageblood, we're going to be able to run a reduced mana cost of skills roll on one of our flasks. And we combine this with a 70% increased effect from an Enkindling Orb. This means that our temp chains basically cost no mana as is. So realistically, we're never going to run into a problem where this screws us over. We have no energy shield left and we can't press Impending Doom because it just costs so little to begin with. It should never really be a problem. This is added into Path of Building under the config with Mind Over Matter added on here. But as soon as Path of Building is updated, as soon as we can tattoo keystones, I'll be updating the Path of Building with Ghost Reaver actually being the proper thing. But we're simply picking it up here just to represent the one passive point that would have actually used up. Next up, I want to talk about the gear and any of the changes that are going to be happening here. So I think the first thing we should go over, the big elephant in the room, is going to be Mageblood. Now, you are not going to need Mageblood. This Path of Building is going to be centered around it and how you can min-max everything with a Mageblood, but you can more than just fine run a normal belt, which I have a crafting guide for, and I'll link in the description below, which you most likely are using already. And the only thing you're going to have to pay attention to is your lightning resistances. It's going to be a little bit low, but as long as you get one lightning resistance roll somewhere, you'll be completely fine. Other than that, Mageblood is going to allow us to do some very silly things that aren't really possible without it. The first example I gave a few seconds ago was simply the fact that because we have no mana cost anymore effectively, because of the increased effect on a mana cost of skills roll, we can run the Mind Over Matter Eldritch Battery tech. The other thing that's going to allow us to do is going to allow us to get an insane amount of cast speed through the 70% increased effect on a cast speed suffix, meaning that this is going to take care of basically the majority of your cast speed requirements, and it's going to play a very, very long way into you being able to get enough cast speed for the 60% cooldown recovery breakpoint. Now, I know this is not going to be using Mageblood to its full extent. We are not actually using 3 utility flasks. And because of that, you can look for a 3 flask Mageblood if you like. If you are 100% dead set on playing this build for the rest of the season, a 3 flask Mageblood is completely fine. There's no difference between 3 and 4. The only thing to keep in mind is if you don't want to use that Mageblood later on, you are going to have a little bit of a rough time selling your 3 flask Mageblood, but they do sell, and they do sell relatively fast. It's just one thing to keep in mind. Otherwise, we are going to want to put the Wither enchant on our Mageblood, and this is done by running Dedication to the Goddess lab runs, and this is about a 5% DPS increase or so, which is a pretty nice late game min-max to go for. But as I mentioned, Mageblood is not required and you can make this work just fine without it. The only thing you'd be changing is you would not be running the 70% increased effect rolls on all of your flasks. It's just Mageblood effectively will double your EHP because we're going to fully convert all of our damage over to elemental, meaning that these flasks being effectively twice as strong effectively just doubles our EHP when we combine with Progenesis. Next up, let's talk about all the other gear. So the first thing to mention about our weapon is it's basically the same thing. The only difference here is we're going to now be using tempering orbs to try and get a explicit chaos modifier magnitude roll on it. Now, please do not do this if you do not have a lot of money. Tempering orbs are going to cost anywhere between 6 to 8 div each. They fluctuate depending on what mirror crafts are currently going on. And getting the roll that you actually want on your item is going to basically be impossible, as the chances for all of the mods to roll are weighted pretty equally. Nobody knows the exact weightings on them, but it's going to probably cost you anywhere between 20, 30, 40 tempering orbs to realistically have a chance at seeing what you want. This is going to be about a 5% DPS increase, as it's going to increase the chaos multi, the damage of poison, and the generic chaos damage rolls up by whatever percent you get on it, but treat this as basically one of the last things you'd be doing this build for a little bit of extra damage. Moving on to shield, nothing is actually changing here. A Series Reflection and Dawnbreaker are both the absolute best in slot shields for this build, and you can simply choose to run whichever one you'd like, as they're both going to be the exact same thing as before. You're going to run a series if you want utility of resistances, of a little bit more ES, which is actually probably going to make it better than Dawnbreaker because it's going to give you a large enough ES pool to make the mom tech worth it. And it's going to give you some increased damage, while Dawnbreaker is going to fully convert you, which if you need the extra tankiness is probably going to be the go-to play, while giving you no extra damage on top of it. Moving on next to the helmet. So the helmet is going to completely change from the helmet you had before. We are going to absolutely try to get a perfect helmet for this build. This is still going to have the same essence as the previous helmet, where we're going to take a fractured spell express base and then we're going to craft off of it. But do make sure you get a max roll one, as that will save you 1 extra spell suppression tattoo in reaching 100%. What we're going to be doing with this is we're now going to be using dexterity essences to spam for tier 1 chaos resistance. This is going to completely fill our suffixes. Then for our prefixes, we're going to be using Eldritch Currency to Eldritch Exalt spam for tier 1 life, or if that's too expensive for you, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4. And then we're simply just going to be using Eldritch Currency further to get absolute perfect Eldritch implicits of cast speed and damage taken as. Now, the damage taken as can be whichever one you get. It can be either fire, cold, or lightning, doesn't matter. But I just simply put fire on here. There is a full crafting guide on how to make this helmet in the notes section below. It is pretty long and it does take quite a bit to actually get through all of it. And it's going to be pretty expensive, but it's going to be not beatable by literally anything else. You can effectively see this helmet as the mirror tier helmet for Impending Doom, and there's absolutely nothing better than it. A Shaco really isn't better than this, as Shaco, in my opinion, is kind of unnecessary, especially since we're basically almost at Uber dot cap as is. But you could potentially consider a Shaco as well, but I'm not going to be covering it here. Next up for the lightning coil, it's going to be the same lightning coil as before. The only change now is you are going to try and look for +2/+1 if you can. Now, I don't really think these are going to exist, and if they are, they're probably going to cost hundreds of divs, but that's the only real thing you could do to upgrade your lightning coil further. And if you do manage to get yourself a +2/+1, it'll be about a 17% DPS increase over just a regular +2. Moving on to Vixens, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be trying to find ourselves a corrupted pair with cast speed on it. Now, we do not want any of the curses on hit. We only want to get cast speed on here. You could also look for % max life or % max ES if you can get that too. But cast speed is going to be the most important thing. If you are buying yourself a corrupted pair of Vixens, try to make sure you get one that is as close to max cast speed as possible, as you're going to need all of the cast speed you can possibly muster to reach the cast speed required for Awakened Spell Cascade. Up next is going to be boots. So we are completely changing our boots from the Eldritch boots that we had before into Elevated Shaper, Elevated Hunter, Cooldown Recovery, and Tailwind boots. Now, there's going to be a crafting guide for this in the notes section as well on how to make them. And potentially you could go for non-elevated boots if you need something cheaper. But these are simply just going to be a pair of random elevated Tailwind and a pair of random elevated cooldown recovery rate boots being smacked together with a Awakener's Orb. We're going to hope that they have open prefixes. Then we're going to prefix Scour, use a Veiled Chaos Orb, find yourself movement speed, and then just craft life at the end. There is space for one prefix and one suffix on here, and you're going to just hope that they're going to be a decent prefix and suffix. Now, the tailwind is going to be relatively easy to keep up. I know a lot of people are going to be asking, Allie, do we crit enough for the tailwind? And yes, you will. Currently, with a 5 overlap setup, we're doing 31 hits per second. Even at a 5% crit chance, 31 hits per second basically guarantees you are at least critting once or twice per second. And if that's not enough, we're going to be trying to get the lab enchant for 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently to absolutely make sure you will never have a bad luck streak of getting a crit within a few seconds to be able to keep your tailwind active. You only need to do 1 crit every 4 seconds to get your tailwind, which is a very, very easy to do, especially the amount of hits that we're doing. Moving on next to the amulet slot. So the amulet slot is going to still be pretty flexible. You can still choose to run a crafted amulet. If you like your crafted amulet, it'll give you quite a lot of damage and get you substantially closer to Uber Cap. You can still choose to run a Eternal Struggle as well if you want the extra attributes of it. The intelligence on Eternal Struggle is going to be really nice because that means you'll be able to tattoo every single one of your int gems into more life. And Eternal Struggle can effectively be seen as 15% more damage because you're calling everything at 15% life, which is effectively just 15% more damage. When we add that with all of the increased effects of having a good one, for example, having an increased effect of Curses one, Eternal Struggle actually does end up beating a crafted amulet by quite a bit. So I would only stick with a crafted amulet until you can find absolutely really nice Eternal Struggle. Or your new option for 3.22 is using the new amulet Defiance of Destiny. This amulet is silly. Now, I know in the mid-game path of building and the early game path of building, I talked about us going Eternal Struggle and us going Transcendence, but this amulet has completely changed everything. You don't need to do any of that anymore. What Defiance of Destiny does is it has a new stat on it that is not available anywhere else in the game. Gain a % of your missing unreserved life before being hit by an enemy. So if you're at 0 health, what this means, assuming you weren't dead, what this means is you would gain 42% of your health instantly before the damage of an enemy actually registers. This, when combined with Blood Notch, and when combined with our Insane Recovery, and combined with our reduction in damage, effectively just makes us immortal. I would argue this is better than Transcendence and Eternal Damnation, while being substantially easier to fit into your build because you don't need to run a lore weave, you don't need to change anything about your build at all. You're simply just losing the damage from an actual good amulet or effective immortality for a single slot. Not only that, but it has life on it, which is amazing. And it has all 3 resistances on it, making getting your resistance cap if you don't have a Mageblood even easier. For how cheap this amulet is, it is disgustingly overpowered, and I think this basically should be a chase item. The other thing to mention is the missing unreserved life has a life tag, which means you can Fertile Catalyst it. A normal Defiance of Destiny is only 35%, but if you Fertile Catalyst it, it becomes 42%. If you want to never die, I would go get yourself one of these amulets and just completely ignore the DPS loss of the other amulets. You'll still be more than over non-Uber Cap with this. And this will basically make it so you can just AFK every single mechanic in the game. I cannot say enough good things about this amulet. I cannot tell you just how strong it is. Moving on to our rings, they're going to be the exact same rings as before. Nothing is changing here because there's really no other good rings. The ring that you crafted, if you did craft one of these rings, the mid-game path of building, basically is unbeatable by everything else. You can make this a little bit better by getting tier 1 life on there manually and not having to deal with a multi-mod, but it's a little bit too expensive and that just seems like a pointless craft to me. That doesn't really add anything else. So just saying this ring is good enough for an endgame path of building seems good enough to me. For the other ring, we're going to be using a Circle of Nostalgia. Now, ideally, because you have a Progenesis, which is going to give you a decent amount of your Chaos Res, because you have Fugitive Boots, which have Chaos Resistance as a base, and because you're getting a Chaos Res roll on your helmet, you won't really need to get a Chaos Resistance Circle of Nostalgia anymore. But if you still need Chaos Resistance, get yourself one that gives you increased Chaos Resistance while you have your Herald active. But if you don't need any, and if you are Chaos Res capped like this, what you can simply do is just get yourself a damage while affected by Herald of Agony and increased buff effect Circle of Nostalgia, and this will give you a substantial amount of DPS. The other thing to mention is to actually hit Poison Cap, you will need to have buff effect. So if you do want to go for a Chaos Resistance one, make sure you're giving up the chaos damage while affected by the Herald instead of the buff effect, as the buff effect does affect the increased poison chance from Herald of Agony. The last and final thing to mention, and this is going to be where basically half of the budget in this path of building is realistically going to be the Watcher's Eye. Now, 100% physical conversion is possible only if you find yourself a Watcher's Eye that looks like this. This is a triple physical damage from hits converted to elemental while affected by purity of elements Watcher's Eye. I can tell you this is basically not going to exist all season, or if it does, it's going to be instantaneously sold for mirrors as soon as it gets posted. This, in my opinion, is the only item in here that is basically unrealistic for anyone to find. But if we are going for absolute aspirational, this is what you would want to find. Because it's not going to be existent, what you would instead do is get yourself a double physical as elemental. Double physical as elemental, and doesn't matter which 2 of the 3 you get, is going to be about 20 to 50 div, somewhere around there. And it's very reasonable to get. To make up for the 12% on this Watcher's Eye, what you'd want to do is you would want to go and corrupt your shield, either your Asterius or your Dawnbreaker, and you want to get yourself a corruption for physical damage taken as. Now, these only go to 8%, so they will not fully make up the 12% from Watcher's Eye. So you'll be like 96, 97% converted, but honestly, that's going to be more than enough since you have 2,000 armor. And 96, 97% conversion, this 2,000 armor is effectively like 100,000 armor. So it should be more than fine, but I am adding this in just to let you know that this exists. And if you do get this, you would effectively get your implicit back on your series reflection, which means you get a little bit movement speed, but you do not need this by any means. You do not need this. You can still be basically unkillable without it. But I do highly recommend to look for a double physical taken as Watcher's Eye instead of what you currently might have on your Watcher's Eye. As one, we don't need the damage if you have a Malevolence one. And 2, getting 2 physical is going to be substantially more EHP. The last thing I want to mention is this EHP does not account for all of the other bullshit that's going on our build. This is not accounting for Blood Notch, it's not accounting for Defiance of Destiny. When you add those on here, I would say your actual hit pool is probably somewhere around 1 million, if not more. These 2 together, when added with this much just raw tankiness, makes this build basically immortal. I would say we finally have reached immortality. Now, it's not going to be immortality against Omega Degens. You're not going to be able to tank a Cyrus Stone, for example. We do not have enough recovery for that. But anything that isn't a dot, and even dots, because we have Leaf Shade, which is going to make all dots for 1 second basically do nothing. But everything but dots, you can effectively face sync. If you manage to put this whole Path to Billion together without the triple Watcher's Eye, and if you somehow die to something, you can come and yell at me, because this should not die to anything. This, in my opinion, is true immortality to basically the whole game. That's all I really have to say for this video. I hope I showed you where to potentially go with Impending Doom. I hope I showed you all the upgrades you can make. There really isn't much, as the mid-game path to building, in my opinion, was already pretty min-max. I tried to bring it as close to aspirational as I could without making items balloon in terms of cost to silly amounts. But for the people who have been asking for how to upgrade even further, I hope this was useful on telling you about all the things that you could possibly do to take your build even further. If you do want to reach true immortality, and if you do want to just have a silly amount of DPS, because this build is stupid. The damage that Impending Doom can do is the silliest thing I've ever seen for how tanky it is. I think, in my opinion, this build at a like 1.5 mirror budget, mind you, that 1.5 mirror budget also includes a Mageblood. So basically Mageblood plus 200 div or so is probably the best build in the game, at least for the amount of money they're putting into it. I think it's the best bang for your buck for a super high-end build. And honestly, I was really happy to play it this season. I had a lot of fun with it. I enjoyed doing 6-man feared carries with it. Sorry, cut that. I enjoyed doing 6-man uber elder carries with it, which were just really fun. And I can tell you, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence to actually do that on any other build except for Impending Doom. I've just had a great time with this build this season. I hope you enjoyed it too. And if you're watching this in future seasons, I hope you enjoy this build as well, because it's just a jewel. It's absolutely fun. It's the best thing I've ever played in this game. Hands down, the best build I've ever played at any point in the past few years. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I also stream on Twitch every single day. Feel free to come by and ask me any questions there. But other than that, I hope you enjoy the video. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you guys in the next video.